The neighborhood of Cedar Pines was the kind of place where uniformity reigned supreme. Every house, painted in a mild shade of taupe or beige, stood in neat rows, separated by identical white fences and obsessively manicured lawns. Trees lined the sidewalks with such symmetry that one might assume they had been planted using a laser grid. And at the heart of this idyllic suburban world was the Homeowners Association, an institution that governed everything from trash bin placement to the precise hue of your front door. For most residents, the HOA was a mild nuisance at best and a necessary evil at worst. But for one man, it was his calling. Greg Milner, aged 47 and retired early from a mid-level management job at a logistics company, took his role as HOA board member, and more importantly, as self-declared neighborhood compliance officer, with a zeal rarely seen outside of military institutions. Greg wasn't just proud of Cedar Pines, he believed in it. He believed in the rules that made it what it was. And he believed that any deviation, no matter how small, threatened to unravel the entire fabric of their quiet utopia. So, when Carol Hayes, a 53-year-old widow and 10-year resident of the neighborhood, installed a new mailbox on a quiet Friday morning, Greg was watching. Carol had always kept to herself. She wasn't exactly unfriendly, but she didn't attend HOA meetings, she didn't join the summer barbecue planning committee, and she certainly didn't respond to Greg's monthly HOA newsletters. She had, for the most part, flown under the radar, until that morning. The new mailbox stood proudly at the edge of Carol's neatly trimmed lawn. It was black, sleek, and made of heavy-duty aluminum with decorative etching on the sides. It replaced an older, rust-speckled model that had been slightly tilted and undeniably dated. Carol thought it looked elegant, modern, practical, but to Greg, it looked like rebellion. At 7:43 a.m., as Greg Power walked past Carol's house in his track suit, earbuds blasting a podcast about leadership habits, he came to a sudden halt. His eyes narrowed. Something was off. He yanked the earbuds out of his ears and took a few steps closer to Carol's mailbox. He circled it like a vulture eyeing prey. Then, with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual more times than he'd care to admit, he pulled out a retractable measuring tape from the fanny pack strapped tightly to his waist. Greg gasped. The mailbox was 2 inches taller than the HOA's regulation height of 42 inches, clearly outlined in Section 3.4.2 of the Cedar Pines HOA Handbook, a laminated copy of which Greg kept in his car, his garage, and, yes, his nightstand. He jotted down the infraction in a small leather-bound notebook marked, Field Notes, and immediately snapped a photo, time-stamped and geotagged for accuracy. He didn't confront Carol right away. That wasn't his style. No, Greg preferred proper channels, documented complaints, and well-worded enforcement notices. By 8 a.m. sharp, he was back at his computer, filing an official infraction notice with the HOA's digital compliance portal. He attached the measurements, the photo evidence, and a formal statement reading. Carol, for her part, was entirely unaware of the brewing storm. That morning, she had gone about her day as usual, watering her roses, reading the paper, and sipping a cup of coffee on her porch. She felt unusually pleased with herself. Installing the new mailbox had taken 2 hours and a bit of YouTube guidance, but the result was worth it. It was sturdy, it locked, and it didn't lean at an awkward angle like the last one. She had even thought, briefly, that the neighbors might compliment her on it. But Cedar Pines wasn't the kind of place where small improvements went unnoticed or unchallenged, not if they deviated from the rulebook. Especially not under Greg Milner's watch. As Carol went inside to clean up, Greg was already drafting a form letter to be mailed the next morning. It would read, in the most official tone possible, "Dear Ms. Hayes, our records indicate a recent alteration to the mailbox structure on your property. Upon review, the installation does not conform to the architectural standards set forth in the Cedar Pines HOA Handbook. We respectfully request that you correct this matter within five business days to avoid further action. Greg printed it, sealed it, and placed it in his compliance delivery folder, yes, an actual folder, for distribution the next day. To him, this was justice. This was order being upheld. He had no idea that this simple letter, this small act of suburban vigilance, would trigger one of the most infamous standoffs in the neighborhood's history. That the mailbox, now quietly baking in the sun at the edge of Carol's lawn, would become the center of a public spectacle involving viral videos, police intervention, and national headlines. But for now, the neighborhood remained calm. The lawns were green, the fences were white, the mailboxes, except for one, stood in perfect formation. And Greg Milner, compliance officer and guardian of law, went to bed that night confident that Cedar Pines was safe for another day. The following morning, Carol Hayes opened her mailbox, the very mailbox that had unknowingly become a neighborhood scandal, to find a neatly folded envelope with the HOA's logo stamped in bold. Across the front, she sighed, already guessing what it was about. Pulling out the letter, she skimmed the overly formal phrasing that seemed to go out of its way to turn 2 extra inches of metal into a public nuisance. Carol had lived in Cedar Pines long enough to know how the law operated, and more importantly, she knew Greg Milner's name would be behind it. It didn't take a detective to recognize his signature blend of passive aggression and clipped legalese. Rolling her eyes, she tossed the letter onto her kitchen counter without a second thought. To her, this wasn't an emergency, it was bureaucracy run amok. But to Greg, Carol's silence wasn't just defiance, it was a threat to the neighborhood's very soul. He waited 2 days, then hand-delivered a second warning letter, this time printed in red ink and slipped under her door with a sticky note that read, "This is your second notice. Please comply." Still, Carol said nothing. She didn't respond, didn't remove the mailbox, and didn't acknowledge the HOA's attempt at micromanagement. Instead, she went about her life, visiting her daughter in town, tending her rose bushes, and enjoying the small victory of doing what she wanted with her own property. Greg, on the other hand, was spiraling into full enforcement mode. On Thursday morning, he posted a not-so-subtle message on the neighborhood Facebook group. Friendly reminder, WA standards exist to protect the value and appearance of our community. Compliance is not optional. The comments exploded almost immediately. Some residents liked the post. Others rolled their eyes and scrolled past. But a few, including Carol's next-door neighbor, chimed in with thinly veiled complaints about certain people who think they're above the rules. Carol read the thread silently, half amused and half infuriated. She didn't reply. Greg, frustrated by her refusal to engage, called an emergency WA board meeting at his house the next day. It was attended only by his wife Darlene, who was more interested in watching her true crime show in the other room, and Ted Owens, a retiree who showed up mostly for the donuts. Greg stood at the front of his living room, dry erase board in hand, detailing the threat of mailbox noncompliance. Today it's 2 inches, he sighed dramatically. Tomorrow it's pink flamingos and driveway murals. Ted nodded, mouth full of jelly donut. Darlene rolled her eyes from the couch. A vote was taken, unanimously in favor of further action. Greg circled, final warning, in red and added one more note to the agenda. If issue not resolved by Saturday, escalate to authorities. It seemed absurd, laughable even, to think that a police call could follow over something so minor. But in Cedar Pines, absurdity had a way of becoming protocol when the HOA was involved, and Greg was just getting started. By Saturday morning, the tension in Cedar Pines was nearly tangible, like humidity before a summer storm. Greg Milner stood on the sidewalk across from Carol Hayes' house, arms folded, jaw set, and eyes locked on the offending mailbox like it had committed a federal crime. Behind him, several curious neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or loitered on porches, pretending to sip coffee while clearly hoping to witness drama. Greg had already given Carol 3 warnings, technically 2 official ones and 1 sternly worded flyer taped to her front door that read like a cease and desist letter. But Carol hadn't budged. Her defiance, in Greg's mind, had crossed the line from negligence to anarchy. And so, armed with what he called sufficient documentation and community backing, he made the call, 911. The dispatcher on the other end hesitated when Greg calmly explained that a resident was knowingly and repeatedly violating property standards and creating disorder in the neighborhood. When asked if there was an emergency, Greg replied firmly, "If the rules aren't enforced, what's the point of having them?" To Greg's surprise, a patrol car actually showed up, albeit slowly and clearly not on high alert. Officer Darren Caldwell, who had been with the department for over a decade, stepped out of the cruiser with the unmistakable posture of a man already regretting the assignment. He was met by Greg, who immediately launched into a rehearsed explanation involving height regulations, the structural uniformity clause, and something about diminishing property value. The officer nodded politely, then made his way up Carol's walkway. She opened the door mid-knock, eyebrows already raised. "Let me guess," she said. Arms crossed. "Mailbox police." Darren offered a sheepish half-smile. "Ma'am, we received a call about a potential neighborhood dispute. Just here to keep the peace." Carol stepped outside and pointed dramatically at her mailbox. This is the emergency." Darren walked over, gave it a glance, then pulled out his own tape measure, more out of curiosity than protocol. 44 inches, he mumbled. "Well, damn." Carol stared at him, arms still crossed. "You gonna write me up?" she asked dryly. Darren chuckled, straightened up, and said, "Ma'am, unless that mailbox starts attacking pedestrians, I think we're good here." He turned back, toward Greg, who was watching from the curb like an anxious coach waiting for a referee's call. When Darren approached, Greg leaned in and whispered, "So, are we issuing a citation?" "At least a warning." Darren put his hands on his hips, sighed, and said, "Greg, it's a mailbox, not a meth lab." Then, without another word, he got in his cruiser and drove off, leaving behind a stunned Greg and a smirking Carol, who waved mockingly from her porch. The neighborhood erupted with whispers. Someone filmed the whole encounter, and by evening, the video had made its way to the local Facebook group, titled, "Walk Karen Calls Cops Over Mailbox." The views skyrocketed. Cedar Pines was officially famous, for all the wrong reasons. By Monday morning, Cedar Pines was no longer just a quiet, regulation-obsessed neighborhood tucked behind white picket fences. It was the center of a full-blown internet sensation. The video of Officer Caldwell responding to Greg Milner's 911 call over Carol Hayes's slightly too tall mailbox had been picked up by local news outlets, reshared by suburban satire pages, and posted on TikTok under the trending hashtag #MailboxMadness. Within hours, millions of viewers were laughing, commenting, and collectively roasting the overreach of HOAs across the country. Carol, who had spent her Sunday casually pruning her garden and ignoring the rising online frenzy, woke up to discover her face, arms crossed, eyebrow raised, standing beside her now famous mailbox, plastered across memes and morning shows. Her daughter called laughing, "Mom, you're the queen of suburban resistance." But while Carol took the sudden fame in stride, Greg was unraveling. His phone buzzed relentlessly, not with praise, but with angry messages from fellow board members, calls from local reporters, and one particularly harsh voicemail from a real estate agent who claimed the video was damaging the neighborhood's reputation. His once prized leadership was now a punchline, his actions branded as the epitome of WA overreach. At an emergency meeting hastily arranged in his driveway, his wife Darlene refused to host it. Endorsed several residents, many of whom had never spoken out before, voiced their frustration. "It's a mailbox, Greg," said one elderly man who had lived in Cedar Pines since it was built. "You made us look ridiculous." Another woman added, you called the police over 2 inches of aluminum. What were you thinking? Greg tried to defend himself, citing order and rules, but it was clear the tide had turned. By Wednesday, Greg issued a written resignation from the HOA board, citing unjust public scrutiny and a personal need to step back. The letter was posted to the community bulletin board, though most residents had already seen it online, annotated and memed to death. Carol's mailbox, meanwhile, stood untouched, now something of a local landmark. People slowed their cars to take photos. A few teenagers even left tiny plastic trophies at its base. The HOA, eager to salvage its reputation, quietly amended the handbook, allowing for minor non-structural mailbox variances up to 3 inches, a move that Greg would have once considered blasphemy. Carol never gloated publicly, though she did buy a new mailbox flag in the shape of a thumbs up. Let the HOA interpret that one, she joked to a neighbor. In the end, Cedar Pines returned to something close to normal: lawns mowed, dogs walked, mail delivered. But the story of the infamous mailbox lived on, a tale retold at block parties and neighborhood meetings. It served as a reminder that sometimes, order is good, but a little common sense is better. And that in a world of rules, it only takes 2 extra inches and a stubborn homeowner to make the whole country